You have to basically deal with me now. But Emma is really somebody who's an expert in this topic as well. And not just an expert, but I would also say she's quite an inspiration to many people who work on this kind of topic. I just want to highlight some interesting work she's done that you might want to check out. She's an accessible sort of primer on how to do a pre-registration and registered report. That's a preprint on MetaArchive, and a 10 simple rules for writing a registered report. She's also an expert on doing them because she published registered reports herself, but also, at least as far as I know, she's one of the first, or maybe the first person to do her PhD completely in registered report formats. So I think that's quite inspirational. And there's also a link if you really am disappointed that you can't see Emma now, then you can click away to YouTube and you can go and watch her give a talk about this topic somewhere else. All right. Well, that being said, I have one other thing, but yeah, you don't see, there's no camera. That's too bad. Well, maybe for the people who are watching at home, but I also have these coasters. Yeah, it's difficult for the people in the audience. You can't see it, but it's basically a red coaster. Yeah, Sam will try to fix it.
I can
Yeah, just a second. I think it's just personal. So Emma's been here, visited my lab a couple of years ago, and she made these lovely coasters that say "Keep calm and justify everything" on a red square kind of coaster. I really like them, and you'll see throughout the talk that this kind of idea of justifying why we do things is really important to me, I think, but I think it should be very important to scientists. So, all right, that's it. Yeah, the rest will be just on the slides. All right, so and I'll talk a little bit about why it's important that we don't treat these new kind of developments, such as pre-registration, as a sort of mindless ritual that you do. And throughout, I'll have a couple of more opinionated sections where I'll talk a little bit about when I think pre-registration is useful and when not so much. So we'll come into this, I think, later. So, but what is a pre-registration? Well, in essence, a pre-registration is a time-stamped description, and the time-stamped is important. So there's a public record of when you made some sort of prediction about what you will test, and you've written this down, and we can check when you've done this. And the important part of this is that you're going to write something about your design and your analysis plan before you have looked at the data. Now, this is a peculiar thing to do, but I'll explain why we think this is an interesting approach to doing science and when it's an interesting approach to doing science. And especially also what kind of philosophy underlies this kind of approach to doing science. It's important because you can disagree with this underlying philosophy, and then you can develop your own alternative philosophy, but there is some sort of idea behind this, and I think it's important to know. Now, in general, when we do science, we rely on a kind of skeptical attitude. I think there have been many examples throughout the workshop so far why you should be a little bit skeptical sometimes, but we build this into the scientific process. And one place where we build this in is, for example, the peer review process that basically exists to have some often anonymous people criticize your research with an attempt to make it better, of course, as good as possible. And especially to prevent people from making biased claims. So peer reviewers might say something like, well, you're kind of being too strong here, or this kind of claim doesn't logically follow from the data you have, whereas sometimes people really want to make certain claims. So it's a very human kind of thing to do, right? To want to make claims, but have a little bit of bias. And the organized skepticism part of science is to try to push back, to have part of the methodological procedure that we have as scientists to push back to some kind of bias people might have. So that's organized skepticism. And you might have experienced this yourself. So sometimes you read a paper and you are a little bit skeptical. You know, maybe you think, really? Is this really what you set out to do in your study? Was this really the idea? And, you know, you can go too far, but I think a little bit of skepticism or critical attitude here is quite important. Ideally, you wouldn't have to guess whether people actually wanted to do what they end up reporting in their paper. It would be very nice if you could just see what they plan to do, if there's much more transparency about this. But for most of science, this wasn't possible. We didn't have the tools available to make all aspects of this work transparent. So sometimes you would see something by a scientist, you would be like, really? Is this really what you wanted to do or not? So maybe you experience this. One case where this sometimes happens is if you would see somebody report a one-sided test, and in this one-sided test, they end up with a p-value of 0.03. And then you kind of know, like, well, if they would have done a two-sided test, then this p-value would have been 0.06, and it would have fallen just above the threshold for statistical significance. It falls just below it if they do a one-sided test. And then you might think, really? Were you planning to do this all along? Or did you look at your data and then decide to turn it into a one-sided test? And I think it's a reasonable thing to wonder about. Now, if you pre-register, you don't really have to let people sort of guess about your intentions. It makes it possible for your peers to take a transparent look at all the choices you've made when analyzing the data. And of course, it's still perfectly possible to take a look at your data, perform a test, see that it's not statistically significant when you do a two-sided test, and then you say, I've decided to change my mind. I'm going to do a one-sided test because I think it's better. And then, of course, we're back to the coaster, justify everything. And you say, well, because now my result is statistically significant. Well, you can perfectly transparently mention this. It's lovely. But people might be a bit critical about your arguments for some decisions, right? And in the end, we'll talk about when you can deviate and have good arguments for deviations, right? It doesn't mean that all of them are bad. The main thing of the pre-registration is we make it possible to sort of transparently take a look at why people deviate from their plans. So that's what we're trying to do with this pre-registration. Now, there's some meta-scientific research on what people think when people have pre-registered a study. And in this data that you see, it basically has the opinion of people, whether it increases or decreases their confidence in the claims that people make in their papers, when it's pre-registered or not. Now, I mean, first of all, I want to point out that there's one person who says, I think they're less, I have lower confidence after pre-registration. That's just your reminder that if you collect data from people, you'll always get some weird results that make no sense whatsoever. But on the other hand, there are two groups of people here, basically. There's one group of people that says it doesn't matter in essence. If you pre-register or not, it doesn't change how confident I am in the claims. And I think that's a very defensible answer. But what we also see is that many people say, oh yeah, if it's pre-registered, I have much greater confidence in your claims. That's also a defensible answer. It depends a little bit on what your ideas are about people and scientists. If your ideas are that most scientists are sort of sneaky and they try to hide things from you and make things look better than they are, then of course pre-registration is going to increase your confidence in claims. But if you think, well, some people do a good job when they pre-register, some people do a bad job when they pre-register, so just the pre-registration in itself is not enough to change my confidence in a claim, you would also have something going for it. We'll see both of these sides throughout the talk. All right, so pre-registration does something very interesting, and it's important to know exactly what it does. So there are a lot of sort of possible benefits of pre-registration. I think it's good to get to the core of what I think the core is of what the pre-registration does. And it prevents something that's a very old complaint about the way that people do science or make claims, and that's known now as the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. And the idea of the Texas sharpshooter fallacy is sort of what you see here on this slide. So somebody fires arrows in a wall, or I think the Texas sharpshooter uses a gun, shoots bullets at a barn door. And then instead of drawing the circles in advance, you draw the circles after the arrows have hit the wall. So of course, you can perfectly hit the center of a bullseye if you paint the target around wherever the arrow landed. So this is the problem. I also like this figure a lot because it kind of looks like the PhD student has to draw all the arrows and the professor is doing all the shooting. So I think that's also kind of maybe common, and maybe reminds me of this talk of yesterday. Now, it is good to take a moment and think, but what is the real problem here? Because it's not so super intuitive what the problem is. Now, you might say, well, this person is not a good shot. But actually, we don't really know if this person is a good shot or not. So it might be that this person is a perfectly fine sharpshooter. And in a real situation, if we would paint the targets on the wall, they would just hit the bullseye again and again and again. But the problem here is that we haven't done anything to severely test whether they are actually a good shot. So in the case where we don't see the whole procedure, and it's kind of weird, you know, typically what we do in science is we really watch people shoot a wall. We say we watch the end result, right? We don't see anything that happens in the process. It's like people all of a sudden appear, they stand next to this wall and they say, look, here are the arrows in the wall, or here are the bullet holes. But we don't see the whole process. So if you are not transparent about the whole process, it could look like this sharpshooter is doing a perfect job. It's a very old complaint, by the way. I like going back to old texts, but this sharpshooter fallacy was actually first pointed out by John Venn, a mathematician, who's the same Venn as the Venn diagram person. So this is in 1866. So nothing about these kind of complaints is new. People already complain about this. And if you want to read up on it, the slides are on the OSF, so you can read it. Now, what is the problem here? Now, the problem is this point that I briefly mentioned, how severely we've tested whether this person is a sharpshooter. And this idea of severe testing, this is the part of the philosophy underlying pre-registration. So if we severely test something, what it means is, if we're right about our prediction, the procedure we use to make a claim is very likely to show that we were right about it. And at the same time, the procedure has to work in a way that if we're wrong about the claim, the procedure has a very high probability of showing that we are wrong. Right? So basically, a severe test will tell us that we're right when we're right, and it will tell us that we're wrong when we're wrong. So that is this idea of severe testing. And when we test a scientific hypothesis, we also want to have a severe test of a scientific hypothesis. So what's the problem with the sharpshooter? Well, if the sharpshooter sucks, they don't know what they do at all, then the procedure we're using when we're drawing the circles after the shot, is very unlikely to show us that this person is not a good sharpshooter. So the procedure does not lead to a severe test. If this person can't shoot at all, they will look like they're doing a great job. So the procedure has no probability of showing that somebody is not a sharpshooter if we think that they're a sharpshooter. All right. So in science, we don't shoot at walls, but what we do is we sometimes create hypotheses after we look at the data. Now, if you come up with your hypothesis after looking at the data, what is the probability that the data will prove you wrong? Well, for this hypothesis that you came up with after looking at the data, it's impossible to falsify this hypothesis by the data because you created it based on looking at the data. So this procedure, which is called harking, hypothesizing after results are known. So this procedure is basically impossible. Like, it doesn't allow you to prove yourself wrong. So it's not a severe test. That doesn't mean that if you come up with a hypothesis by looking at the data, that hypothesis is not right. I mean, the hypothesis might be correct. Just like the sharpshooter might be a real sharpshooter. but the procedure we use doesn't do anything to give us more confidence in this hypothesis, because the procedure wasn't able to prove us wrong if we would be wrong about the hypothesis. So if it's wrong, there's nothing in the procedure that will tell us that we were wrong. So this is the core of the issue of this sharpshooter fallacy, and basically the core of the issue of a non-severe test, right? It's unlikely to tell us anything, to give us confidence in the claims that we make. So in science, we call it harking. There's a very nice paper by Kerr from 1998 about this that I can highly recommend reading. Hypothesizing after results are known. And this is a common practice. If you ask people, do you do this? Many people admit that at least in one paper somewhere in their career, they came up with a hypothesis after looking at the data. So they admit to doing this. So basically, they admit to presenting claims where they do this sharpshooter trick. They shoot at the barn door, they look at where the holes are, and then they create a story around it, right? So that's not something that should increase our trust in the hypothesis, but because it's not transparently reported, yeah, we think that it looks pretty impressive, but it isn't. And we'll see some examples where people can make things look very impressive, but then they don't replicate, for example. All right, now harking is just one of many ways in which we can reduce the severity of a test. So basically, whenever we're reducing the severity of a test, we're increasing the probability that we'll fool ourselves, right? Another practice that's been mentioned before is selective reporting. So you choose which things to report from your data, or you do many tests, and then you report only some of the tests. And this, of course, has come up already before. Angelica Stefan on Monday talked about p-hacking. And I think she made a very good point that we don't really have a very good definition of p-hacking. Psychologists like to talk about practices and doing stuff. And she points this out. So p-hacking is, for example, doing this thing, selectively reporting. Or p-hacking is doing some optional stopping procedure. So that's often the level at which psychologists explain things. And this is why I'm harping so long about severe testing, because if you want to have a good definition of p-hacking, it's basically any data analysis practice that untransparently reduces the severity of a test. So all these things that people sometimes call questionable research practices, a better term for it would be practices that reduce the severity of a test without being transparent about it, right? So optional stopping, if you just keep testing, you collect data, you look at it after a couple of data points, and then again and again, and you run a test, and you keep doing this, eventually the probability of a type 1 error will reach 100%. If you're patient enough and you can collect enough data, you will always observe a significant result through optional stopping. That means that if you do this in an extreme way, if you're actually wrong about your claim, the test is not severe at all. You will always find a significant result. So this practice of optional stopping is one way that you can destroy the severity of your test, basically. But all of these questionable research practices do the same thing. All right. So it means that we have to care about severely tested predictions, right? This idea, this is at the core of what we're trying to do here. We want people to claim things, but the procedure that leads them to these claims has to be a procedure where they could have proven themselves wrong when they're wrong. And then if they actually prove themselves right, well, then we trust it more, because if they would be wrong, we would have known about it as well. All right. Now, you can p-hack and be right about things. People always think that p-hacking, that anything that you've p-hacked must be a wrong claim, but that's not true at all. It's the same as with the sharpshooter fallacy. You can p-hack a true result. And if you do this, what you actually do is you just increase the statistical power of your test. Of course, if you p-hack and there's no effect at all, then you increase the type 1 error. But if you p-hack and there's a true effect, you decrease the type 2 error. You increase the power. Now, That doesn't mean that it's good to do, because it still destroys the severity of the test. But you might be right? You can p-hack your way, or you can hark your way to a right claim. The problem is we can't trust the claim so much. All right, because we didn't use a procedure that gives us trust in your claim. Now, these problems, again, they're very old. Venn already pointed them out before. There's this book that I also really like, just to give you an indication of how long we're trying to fix these issues. And I think this is important, because when we talk about pre-registration and registered reports, we'll see that we're trying to fix these issues, but after a really long time, like almost 2 centuries. So here's Charles Babbage in a book, Reflections on the Decline of Science in England and Some of Its Causes. And he says this practice of cooking that he describes, this is an art of various forms, the object of which is to give to ordinary observations the appearance and character of those of the highest degree of accuracy. One of its numerous processes is to make multitudes of observations, and out of these to select those only which agree, or very nearly agree, with what you want to find. If 100 observations are made, the cook must be very unlucky if he cannot pick out 15 or 20 which will do up for serving. So 2 centuries ago, he's complaining about people doing selective reporting and being untransparent about it. And now, finally, after all this time, we maybe have some sort of solution to prevent this kind of mess. All right, so we basically want to make sure that there's a little bit more transparency about what's going on, so people can't do this cooking anymore, so that we can see what they're up to. This is something people tried to fix for a while. There's one of my favorite examples of how to fix this, comes from a paper in 1966 by Bacon. He discusses this issue that I mentioned in the beginning, the choice of a one-sided versus a two-sided test. And yeah, it is kind of a decision you need to make. And he also says, yeah, this is a bit of a difficult situation, because, it's not given. You can do both. You have to make a choice. And then he writes here at the end, and somehow making the decision after the data were collected and the means computed seemed like cheating. Yeah, and, if you do it opportunistically, if you do it just to get your results significant, I think it is cheating, of course. So this is a difficulty, and he says, how should this be handled? What should we do about this? I'll skip this, but I'll give you the solution that he proposes. He says, what about if we have a central registry to specify our analysis? And he says, should there be some central registry in which one registers one decision? Again, this is 1966, right? Where one registers one decision to run a 1 or a 2-tailed test before collecting the data. Should one, as one eminent psychologist once suggested to me, send oneself a letter so that the postmark would prove that one had pre-decided to run a 1-tailed test? And this is also a nice thing to do. You can just send yourself a letter, have a post stamp, and this post stamp is the public stamped time. At this moment, I thought about doing a 1-tailed test. And then later, when you find a p-value of 0.06 in a 2-sided test, and in your 1-sided test it's 0.03, and a peer comes by and says, I don't believe you, I think you've been cheating, you can take this letter out of your pocket, you can show the timestamp, and you say, haha, here I am. They're good of you to be skeptical, but I can actually transparently show that I have not been messing around here. All right. So now it's become possible for you to pre-register your analysis plan. You can do this. There are now all sorts of platforms where you can do this online. The Open Science Framework is probably best known for allowing people to upload documents or fill in some forms, create a frozen version with a timestamp that you can't change, that's just stored on the Open Science Framework, that you can point to when you submit your manuscript for publication. And then peers can go and take a look and say, oh, look, they actually planned to do this one-sided test. That's what they set out to do. They don't have to guess about whether you're honest or not. They can evaluate it themselves. All right, so that's the basic idea of pre-registration. Now you can write a pre-registration when you have to collect the data, when it's not collected yet. You can also, under circumstances, do it for existing data sets. But here I told you I would be sometimes a little bit opinionated about when you can pre-register and when I think pre-registration is not really the thing to do. Now, it doesn't mean you can't always do the action of pre-registering, but what I mean is you don't get the core benefit, which is allowing peers to transparently evaluate the severity of a test. So if there is existing data, we call this secondary pre-registration. So you're pre-registering something, but the data already exists. Then if you want to allow peers to transparently evaluate whether you didn't come up with your analyses after looking at the data, well, the only way to do it is by proving in some way that even though the data existed, you were not able to look at it. This is a high bar, but people have talked about where these bars are in terms of the level of transparency that you can provide about your data analysis choices. And this table comes from the Peer Community In Registered Report website. And they distinguish a couple of levels at which you can show how much access you had to the data. So the highest level is basically the most stringent form of pre-registration. And the risk of bias is, well, at the top level, the risk of bias is 0. And when is this the case? Well, there's no data that already exists. You didn't have access to the data, etc. There's basically just no data. So you can't predict the pattern in the data. So there's no bias. Then there's a second level below this, I mean, level 5. And level 5 says all of the data already exists at the moment that you pre-register, but you're able to show you did not have access to it. And this can happen if there's somebody who is basically keeping the data. So you don't have directly access to it. An example of this is a service like the UK Biobank. So they maintain a database. You can request access to it and run analysis on it. But if you don't have access to the data, you can't really look at it before you pre-register. So this is level 5. And then at level 4, there is a higher risk of bias because the difference is the data are accessible to the authors. You have access to your own data, for example. And here, well, here I deviate from what many other people say is still fine. Many other people would say, sure, you can still pre-register. And I agree, you can pre-register in the sense of you can go through the motions and create this timestamp document. But if you already had access to your own data, yeah, you can't convince me that you didn't look at it, right? Now, this is a good topic for discussion. Some people might say, well, you just have to trust me. And then I say, well, that is exactly what pre-registration was there for, to prevent, that we have to rely on trust. We have this, I have this podcast called Nullius in Verba. That's the Royal Society motto, take nobody's word for it. I should be able to see that there was no reason in which you could use data to come up with your analysis plan. So I have a strict bar. I would say level 6, level 5, that's where you pre-register. And below that, I think there are other tools you can use. You can still be transparent, but there are other ways, like an open lab notebook, for example, or you can do sensitivity analysis, or all sorts of ways to demonstrate to me that it's still a severe test, but not pre-registration. Okay, so I'm strict this way. And I think that it's useful to be strict, because if you're strict, you have some sort of justification for why you think we're doing this specific action. Well, that's actually what we want, right? We don't just want to do stuff. And for example, just to give you an overview of a bit of history of how we used to talk about pre-registration and how we were just talking about it as a practice and not as sort of a principled thing like this is what it is. There used to be a time where there were badges where we had pre-registered plus. So you could pre-register, but you could also pre-register plus. And you might wonder, what is the plus thing here? The plus thing was you also included a description of the analysis plan. Really. And I think if you think, but wait, pre-registration is supposed to have a description of the analysis plan, then you agree with me that how we talk about pre-registration in the past has slowly changed. We've become more precise. We've become more formal. This is what we think it is. Now we wouldn't use pre-registered plus anymore. We would just say, of course, it needs the analysis plan that is pre-registration. I think in the future, we'll hopefully talk about these levels 6 and 5 as pre-registration. That's basically where it happens. All right. So we know that people flexibly analyze their data. It's been discussed before. We have now more and more evidence for this. We never know how big the problem is exactly. Would be lovely to know, but we don't. But there are some indications that people use, these questionable research practices. They've been discussed in the workshop before, so I won't go into them. I just want to add that most of them are not very questionable, right? They're just wrong, but okay. So we recently published a paper where we summarize 18 of these surveys across widely different disciplines. This is not just psychology. This is also ecology or many other fields, economics, for example. People do these things across scientific disciplines. And here, for example, in the top right, you can see harking. So this is this practice of hypothesizing after results are known. So how many people say, well, at least once in my career somewhere I presented data and this was harked? Well, the percentages are relatively high. I cut off the axis. That's not so super smart of me, sorry. But I think this is 50%. In the middle of the graph is 50%. Every bar is, I think, 10%. You can see the preprint or the published paper, but basically this is around 40 to 50% over all these surveys. So this happens a lot. All right. Now we also know that this flexibility sometimes leads to problems. I'll give you my favorite example of this. This is research into what's known as ego depletion. And ego depletion is the idea that after this entire workshop, you've done so much cognitive effort, you've spent so much resources thinking, processing things, that you can't really control your own impulses anymore. So afterwards, after the whole workshop, you might think, well, I really shouldn't eat unhealthy. But then you go to the pub and you think, okay, but I should have a salad, but I can't control my own impulses. I'll just go for the unhealthy food. So that's an example of this theory. And then there are a couple of important studies here. The first in 2010 was a meta-analysis of 198 independent tests of the ego depletion effect. That's a lot of tests. That's a whole literature, right? That's a huge amount of research on this. It showed there was a very nice sort of medium to large effect. Cohen's d of 0.62, very impressive. Not a lot of things we study have effects of this size. So this was clearly something worthwhile and important. A reanalysis of the meta-analysis in 2014 used bias detection tools. It said, well, there's pretty much bias in this literature. It's pretty bad. And under some models, I mean, we never know what the unbiased effect size is, but under some models, they suggest that the true effect size might even be 0. And everybody's like, yeah, no way. No way. We have almost 200 tests of this effect. No way that the true effect size is going to be 0. People 2 years later published the first pre-registered replication study. So all of a sudden, we take away the flexibility in how to analyze this data. People have to predict in advance, like this is how we'll analyze it. They have a huge sample size. The ego depletion effect is basically 0. No statistically significant effect. Then, what my favorite part of this is, some people said, you bunch of incompetent replication people, you don't know how to do a study. We'll show you how it's done. And many of the original authors in this field, and this, to their credit, is really impressive. So they decided, no, we really want to know if it's true or not. I mean, I make a joke. Some of the people in this field really did call people who failed to replicate their effects incompetent. But I think many people in this field were like, hey, whoa, this is pretty big deal. Let's go and try ourselves. They tried different variations of it. They worked together, even larger sample size. No effect. So this is quite something, right? We go from almost 200 tests of a hypothesis in a literature where people have flexibility and they can try to maybe sometimes cheat. And then when we take away their ability to flexibly analyze the data, the effect sizes, even the people in this field, the effect size they find are zero. So this is clearly a worst case scenario, but it shows you how far this can go. So this is the stuff we're trying to prevent, right? We don't want this many unsevere tests in the literature. So pre-registration is a useful tool because it can prevent people from opportunistically abusing flexibility. And we have some indications that at least sometimes this seems to happen. It transparently communicates which claims are made with a controlled error rate and which not. So how severely it's been tested, basically. And it's interesting because people say, well, but why would we care if you came up with the hypothesis after looking at the data or before looking at the data? And this is a claim by Keynes already in 1921, where he says, look, I don't care if you came up with a hypothesis after looking at the data or before looking at the data. If anything, after looking at the data, shouldn't you have a higher probability of coming up with a good hypothesis than before? And then you think, kind of has a good point, kind of makes sense. Keynes, maybe pre-registration is a little bit silly. But this, of course, requires that people are very logical. They have to be unbiased. And that's the part he's missing. And then he admits himself, he says, well, I understand some statisticians say, well, it's good to trust things if people have predicted it in advance compared to after looking at the data, because sometimes people will cook the evidence, right? So he also uses this word cook. Maybe he's been reading Babbage and he knows that people are trying to, mess around. And he's like, yeah, of course, if people do that, then you can't trust them. Well, so I think the main thing here is that there's no logical need for something like pre-registration, but because we are humans, there is what we call a social epistemological reason to do this. And what does this fancy word for Scrabble mean? It means we have knowledge generation, which is epistemology. How do we generate knowledge? And this is a social process. There are people involved. And in recent years, a lot of philosophy of science has focused on this social aspect. So that's called social epistemology. So among philosophers of science, they also realized, hey, there are people involved and they're not logical machines. So they have their own wishes and desires. All right. So just to round this part on pre-registration up, and then I'll go and we take a break, and then we'll talk a little bit about registered reports and also what to do if you want to deviate from your plans. That's after the break. What are other benefits? Well, people say that if they pre-register, that they come up with an experimental design and a research hypothesis that is better thought through. And that's nice. Now, you don't have to make a public timestamp to benefit from this thing, right? So in a way, pre-registration gives this as a side effect. You could just say, hey, let's sit down and think carefully. You would get this benefit as well. But apparently we need to push people a little bit. They won't do it by themselves, but if we make them pre-register, they'll also think through their whole design more. And I've experienced this. It's true. If you write down everything in advance, you think much more clearly, oh, wait, but how are we going to include this covariate? If we've only measured it like this, we should, so it helps. It helps. People indicate basically there's a better analysis plan, a better hypothesis, better design. So there's some meta-scientific research that it also, just leads to a better thought-through study, which I think is important. There is a slight downside, and that is people also find it a bit more stressful. Yeah, because you really have to do a good job, and it's not so easy. So I think it's a little bit more stressful to pre-register. You also need to move work forward, which you can otherwise do after the data collection. And people often want to collect data by a certain time, and now they have to do a lot of thinking and thinking about the analysis before they can collect the data. So yes, it's stressful, but also a bit just planning and learning how to plan it in. What's also nice is the increased teamwork, which I think is good, and yeah, a lot of preparatory work basically. So that those are positive things, but a little bit more stress is a negative thing. And the last thing I wanted to show in terms of meta science, and then we'll take a break, is that many people who've done this kind of find it useful. They find it beneficial, but there's this nice plot in the work by Spitzer and Muller. They're doing really interesting work on pre-registration as well. This is, of course, like how important do they perceive pre-registration to be, and also their intention to pre-register. Well, not surprisingly, the people who have experience with pre-registration find it more useful, because otherwise they wouldn't have done it. But I think the other line is important. The people who've not pre-registered as a function of their seniority in the field. I think this is a nice line. So you see young people say, oh, pre-registration sounds like a pretty useful thing, even if they have no experience with it. Senior researchers are less enthusiastic. So that's something you'll have to deal with if you want to pre-register, and maybe your supervisor is not that interested in it. But maybe now you can point to some meta-scientific evidence for the benefits of this. All right. So I've talked a lot. I think it's good to take a break until like 11 or something. Sam, does that sound like a plan?
Yeah, what we'll do is we'll see if there's any questions from the floor, first of all, because I think that would be a good jumping off point for questions. And then once we've exhausted those, or if there's any that we could just say for the next section or the panel discussion, we'll push them forward, and then we'll take a break for a few minutes. So just before we do that, does anybody have any questions? Yeah. Mike.
Thank you so much for very interesting talk. I have a question around the bias you mentioned, sort of having the pre-registered report, so to fight bias, and then like the argument against not having them would make sense if it would be logical, rational creatures like you're not. Isn't there a risk that with pre-registered reports, we kind of think that, oh, so therefore this study is biased, but then the more experienced researchers get, the better the more they can cover their biases, maybe in their pre-registered reports, like interviews for that, and how do the pre-registered reports account for that?
Yeah. So I think it's a very good question, right? And this is also why I showed this figure in the beginning, where you had some people like, are you more confident in claims for pre-registered reports? And some people said, well, I'm going to give it a 0. It really depends. And some people a bit more optimistically maybe, or naively said, yeah, I believe it a bit more. So I think you would answer probably 0 on this questionnaire. And I think it's a very sensible thing to do, because just the presence of a pre-registration is not enough. And what we see in work that's being done now is that we really carefully need to take a look at what did people actually pre-register. We need to evaluate how severely they tested something. The pre-registration only allows us to make this evaluation. So the presence of it is not good enough. And yeah, maybe in a while people become a bit more sneaky in how they pretend to be unbiased because they pre-register. Currently, we can see that they're not sneaky about it at all. And I'll have an example after the break of a pre-registration that is super vague, but people will say in their paper, in our pre-registered study, so they're trying to get away with the benefit of increase in, unbiasedness or perceived unbiasedness. But then you open the pre-registration, like, look, there's almost nothing here. This is not a good thing. And people might become even more advanced. We'll see how it develops. Nevertheless, the absence of any documentation at all makes things so much more difficult to look at, right? So what you should see is we're sort of trying to improve things. This is the first step. We'll make a new step and we'll keep improving. But I think answering 0 is a very sensible thing, at least for now. It really depends. So you still have to go in and take a look and be critical. It's just easier to be critical now than it was 2 decades ago.
Any questions? I've wanted to show me as well. I'll hand the mic over to Charlotte.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for that
Hey.
talk. It was really accessible, very interesting. So, pre-registration's been around in other fields for a lot longer, and psychologists have known the issues of flexibility since the 1900s. So, why do you think that it's taken us until now to really start doing something about this?
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. Like, it's a historical question. I just mentioned before to Sam that I have this new preprint or a revised preprint about the two crises, because there was a similar crisis in the 60s and the 70s, and there's been one now. In that text, I mean, I'm just guessing, right? We don't know, but my guess why things changed now has to do with a very prominent fraud case that happened at the same time as people were discussing p-hacking. So in 2011, two things happened. One was Daryl Bem published a paper on precognition. He had 9 studies showing that people can predict the future. And then people were like, look, this can't be true. So there's something, he's messing with the data in some way. And people pointed this out, this false positive psychology paper that's been discussed. At the same time, there was this fraud case of Dietrich Stapel, which Nick Brown mentioned in his presentation. Now, what I experienced, because, I lived through those years, basically, what I experienced was huge uncertainty among psychologists like, wait, what am I doing? Am I just messing around with my data analysis, or am I committing scientific fraud? And there was a case, Dirk Smeesters, at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, here, my hometown. He got fired because he messed around with his data. He manipulated his data. And he said, but people, really, what I did is nothing different than many other people have done. And people were so worried about being accused of manipulating data that they thought, okay, I don't want to be caught for data manipulation. How can I most transparently show that I'm not manipulating data? I need to do this pre-registration stuff that people are talking about. So that's my explanation why it got there, because people were, and I can't explain well enough how worried people are at this time. I predict that if you could go back in time, you would call up, just after this fraud case, you would call up some people, high-profile people doing a lot of stuff which is on the edge. I think you would say, sorry, they've called in sick. They're not available. These people were so worried. I can't explain how bad it was. And then after a while, of course, we got all these definitions. Okay, this is a questionable research practice, and this is data manipulation, and this is the difference. And yeah, you're still in the gray zone. It's not okay. You need to do better, but we'll allow it. And people are like, oh, thank God. Okay, I'm in the, okay. But this feeling led to a motivation to change. That's my explanation of it. It's an N is one explanation, but that's what I experienced.
Thank you, Dan. So we have 2 questions that I've just spotted. Thank you, Olivia, for pointing them out today. I think you can sort of combine them, but maybe just put them on the board so people in the audience can see. So, did working on these topics lead you to misanthropy? It's about scientific work, maybe particularly in psychology, and how do you avoid that? I don't think just psychology, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's not just psychology, it's like in all fields, in many fields. And I think it used to be in medicine. They just did more to improve things. But I'm not very misanthropic. I work at a human factors department. So the entire reason that we do what we do is because things are never perfect, but we try to create procedures that make things better or safer or less likely to lead to accidents or errors. So I think we're just recognizing things can be a lot better. I think a lot of people are honestly very motivated to do a good job as a scientist. So I think what we need to do is just help and educate people to do a better job. Now, that's a difficult process, takes a lot of time. We need workshops like this summer school, but we can do it, basically. So I'm very optimistic about our ability to do a better job. I think a lot is needed, but if I look at what's happened in the last decade, those are massive improvements. So I'm optimistic in the sense that we'll get there. I'm not so optimistic about, it will be 5 years from now. No, it will be much longer. And there will be other things that we need to fix, many other things, But yeah, we can do that, I think. We have to try at least.
Okay, I'm going to be a bit silent all the time because I think that some of these questions we can push over to the next week. But I will just ask one question and then we'll go for, say, a 10-minute break. Is that all right for you, Daniel? Yeah?
Perfect.
So this is, hey, Daniel, thanks for the great talk. In your ideal world, would most studies need to be registered with courts? When are well-made pre-registrations also sufficient? And what should be our realistic goal for standards in the field?
Yeah. So what is the optimal thing to do in the end? So, I mean, there's a lot of research that doesn't really require anything like pre-registration. We're really talking about hypothesis testing research. And not just wild exploration, which is also fine, right? We're really talking about a specific type of research. Well, what you see in a field like medicine is that for clinical trials, they just require this for all studies. And I think it's a reasonable thing to require this, to make this part of a procedure. And the clinical trials, the question what in other fields equals the importance of a clinical trial, where that threshold is, I don't know. I think we can debate which kind of studies should be included in this requirement. But I definitely think it is fair to discuss and to make it required. It's not popular among scientists to require them to do things. They really like to have their freedom. But again, from my human factors kind of background, that doesn't lead to optimal things. So we probably need to require some things. But maybe we can discuss that later as well.
Super. Okay, so let's go for a short break for about 10 minutes, and then we'll regroup to learn about how you can deviate from your pre-registered protocol. So thank you, Dan. I'll see you in a bit if you want to have a stretch and a coffee.